So fellas, it's no surprise that UFC is the king of MMA, and even though there's these other big organizations out there, MMA nowadays practically is the UFC, and the gap between the UFC and all these other organizations is just getting bigger and bigger and bigger. And this is how the UFC, especially recently, is just killing every promotion. And we're going to start off with stars, because I feel like stars is probably the most important point, because every organization, whether it's MMA, boxing, whatever it is in combat sports, you need a star. It builds the brand, it builds the promotion, it gets the casuals interested. Every promotion is built off stars, and I feel like the UFC have done a really good job in these past few years of just sucking up and taking every big star from every promotion. I mean, look at PFL and Bellator, for example. Let's start off with MVP. Everyone knows MVP. He was the highlight reel outside of the UFC. Even if you don't watch MMA like that, if you're a casual fan, everyone knows MVP. He was probably the biggest star, or one of the biggest stars outside of the UFC. And what did the UFC do? They signed him last year, and MVP actually had quite a good run in the UFC now, going 3-1. What about Patricio Pitbull, who was probably classed as the greatest fighter outside the UFC around this time? And then he obviously was killing outside the UFC. Everyone knew Patricio Pitbull for being this goat outside the UFC. How would he do in the UFC? Again, the UFC managed to sign him. They signed him this year, and he's gone 1-1 in the UFC so far. What about Patchy Mix as well? Similar to Pitbull, people were saying he's one of the best bantamweights in the world, matching theoretical fights between him and Sean O'Malley when O'Malley was a champion. You know, he was giving it the big talk, was Patchy Mix, saying he could beat UFC caliber guys. And to be fair, he was killing outside the UFC. He looked great outside the UFC, had a ton of hype, and the UFC signed him. Or what about Kayla Harrison, probably the greatest women MMA fighter outside the UFC? Came from this big judoka background in Olympics, and she was by far one of the biggest women MMA stars out there when she was a PFL champion. She was a massive star. The UFC, again, managed to sign her. Not only is she in the UFC, but she's the UFC champion as well. Another fighter that they've just nibbed and taxed from a different organization. And other guys as well, like Aaron Pico, who got booked to fight Lerone Murphy, or Ante Delage, who's now been signed to the UFC, or Rizvan Kuniev, who got booked against Blades earlier on this year. Or you can even go to ONE FC, Rainy Derrida, who was probably the ONE FC GOAT, this double champion in ONE FC, probably one of the biggest stars outside the UFC as well. And again, the UFC took Rainy Derrida, and he's had a really good run in the UFC, and he's about a fight away from a title shot. Go over to Ryzen, they took over Kai Asakura, who was the face of Ryzen. Kai Asakura was massive in Ryzen, by far the biggest star. That, like, Alex Pereira's run in 2024 in the UFC is comparable to Kai Sakura's state of how big he was in Ryzen. He was a massive star in Ryzen, probably the face of the promotion, and the UFC took Ryzen's biggest star. They took Kai Sakura. He gets a title shot in his debut. Obviously hasn't gone so well for him because he's now 0-2 in the promotion. They also took Horiguchi as well, another massive star in Ryzen, another big star in Ryzen. Horiguchi, again, one of the better fighters in that promotion. Actually had some good wins as well. He beat Asakura, Manel Cap, and Sergio Pettis, and the UFC have just recently signed Horiguchi as well, as he's been re-signed to the UFC. Go over to Octagon as well. They signed Lozin Kieta, who's probably the Octagon GOAT, who was killing it outside the UFC, a champion in Octagon, double champion in Octagon. People know him for being this KO artist, and he's just been signed to the UFC as well, taking on Patricio Pitbull. Again, one of the biggest stars outside the UFC getting signed. And even other guys as well, like Jacob Wicklax and Luke Riley. The UFC seems to be doing a good job of picking everybody up, and there's literally nothing big outside the UFC these days. Like, we've got Nurmagomedov and Hughes too, which is a massive rematch, I guess. The first one was good. The second one's going to be interesting. That's in PFL later on this year, which people are, you know, looking forward to. But you've got 5 seconds to name anything outside the UFC right now. You can't, because there isn't anything. And the only big names outside the UFC nowadays are, like I said, you've got Nurmagomedov and Hughes, but it wouldn't surprise me if whoever loses that fight, or even potentially who wins if it's Hughes, comes back over to the UFC, or comes over to the UFC. You've got Francis Ngannou, who obviously is a former UFC champion. He's only a big name because of the UFC, and he hasn't competed in PFL since, I think, October now. You've got Umar Kane, who isn't really a big name, but we're kind of just reaching to see if we can get any big star we can outside the UFC. And I feel like the lack of success that these guys have had in the UFC only helps the UFC more. Like Kai Sakura, Patchy Mix, all these other big stars that the UFC have taken from other organizations, most of them have been having unsuccessful runs in the UFC. I mean, look at, like I said, Kai Sakura, best flyweight outside the UFC, the face of Ryzen, this massive star. He's 0-2 in the UFC, and one of those losses was to a 38-year-old Tim Elliott, which makes Ryzen look awful. That, again, just pushes the gap between the UFC and promotions like Ryzen even more, that their best fighter can't even beat Tim Elliott. Or, you know, the greatest Bellator and PFL fighters in guys like Patricio Pitbull and Patchy Mix, these guys who could compete with the guys at the top in the UFC. They've been whooped by UFC contenders. You know, Patricio Pitbull whooped by Yair Rodriguez, Patchy Mix whooped by Yair Rodriguez, not whooped by Mario Batista, not even like champion, you know, level fighters, but contenders that these goats outside of the UFC getting whooped by. And guys like Rizvan Kuniev, who's losing to the likes of Head and Verheerder, and Aaron Pico, who gets knocked out by Lerone Murphy, and these other fighters from PFL who were killing it in PFL and then come over to the UFC and look bad as well. So it's only going to bridge the gap between the UFC and companies like like PFL bigger even more and more. And you go back to the 1990s, this is where we kind of first saw the big competitor for the UFC, Pride FC. Yeah, Pride FC was the first big MMA organization. They had all the big stars, and it is still to this day one of the most reminiscent promotions out there. It was brutal, it was one of a kind. It was the first big MMA organization out there in Japan, with the first kind of big rush of MMA stars. The UFC tried competing, they brought out the Ultimate Fighter with that historical fight with Stephen Bonner and Forrest Griffin, which to be fair did kind of catapult the UFC. That's kind of where they started growing for the first time. But Pride FC was still bigger. The UFC knew they couldn't compete, so what did they do? They simply just bought Pride FC. They took over Pride FC, they bought Pride FC, they bought the rights. Dana White decided he didn't want any competition, he wanted to be the biggest. He bought Pride FC. Pride FC goes away, and this was the beginning of UFC domination. They took over all the big stars from Pride FC. They all came over to the UFC, built the UFC even more, and this is kind of, like I said, the first kind of sign of the domination from the UFC. And then a couple of years later, we had Strikeforce as well. Strikeforce had a bunch of big stars as well in their promotion as well. Guys like Nick Diaz and, you know, just top fighters outside the UFC that kind of led to the growth of Strikeforce, the next big MMA competitor. So what did the UFC do? The same thing again. They just took over Strikeforce. They bought Strikeforce. Dana White decided he didn't want any competitors, bought Strikeforce, shut that down, took all their big stars, and Strikeforce was no more. And again, the UFC profited from it. They got Ronda Rousey, probably the biggest women MMA star in history, that came over to the UFC. They had other guys like Luke Rockhold as well, becoming a UFC champion. Nick Diaz as well, before his ban as well. And again, this only helped grow the UFC, and the only UFC competitor we really had after that was Bellator. And Bellator had, you know, quite a few big stars, you know, across its time. A lot of big stars that, you know, didn't really come over to the UFC. A lot of big fights that never took place in the UFC. So Bellator was always kind of seen as like the second best outside of the UFC. And there were a few fighters as well that were killing it in Bellator that never stepped foot in the UFC. But pretty quickly, Bellator got the reputation for being the home of washed-up UFC fighters. When we're having headliners like Fedor Emelianenko versus Rampage Jackson 3, or Forrest Griffin versus Ken Shamrock, where they're in their 40s and 50s, or Chael Sonnen versus Tito Ortiz Part 2, where they're both way past their prime. This kind of, you know, destroyed the reputation of Bellator, and pretty soon PFL decided to get rid of Bellator. They bought Bellator, they bought the rights, and now PFL is kind of the biggest UFC competitor. But like we said, all the big stars from PFL have now gone over to the UFC, and the vast majority of them are losing as well, which again is only going to hurt the reputation of PFL even more. And PFL has fallen off as well. Like I said, we've got Nurmagomedov and Hughes later on this year, which I'm sure is going to be a big fight. But I mean, look at some of these headliners in PFL. I mean, we're having the likes of Kevin Gisette headline events. Kevin Gisette is a failed UFC fighter. When a guy who's been cut from the UFC and is 2-2 is headlining an event in PFL, that kind of shows the state of the company. And again, it's only building the growth of the UFC and, you know, pushing down PFL and showing that UFC is the biggest. In this new Paramount deal, the UFC have now signed a deal with Paramount, a $7 billion deal, which is massive for the UFC. PFL ain't getting anything like that either. So I just feel like the UFC, they're absolutely killing every competitor. They're taking over all the big stars. And the UFC is just bridging the gap between them and any other big organization out there. So let me know your thoughts on this. I feel like the UFC has just killed all the competitors. These past few years, they've been going ham on signing these stars. It's not been going well for these other companies. And the UFC is just still significantly better. Let me know your thoughts. If you agree, disagree, thank you for watching.